Hey everyone, and welcome. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here for this explainer. Today, we are going to dive right in and demystify some of the most common and honestly, most misunderstood practices in the inclusive classroom. If you've spent any time at all looking into educational psychology or curriculum design, you know you've bumped into two massive buzzwords, scaffolding and differentiated instruction. These terms get thrown around a lot, right? And unfortunately, they're frequently matched together as if they mean the exact same thing. But conflating them is a real problem. It leads to diluted concepts and worse, misapplied classroom practices. So today, we're fixing that. We're going to break down these two distinct yet incredibly complementary tools so you can see exactly how they function and how they empower every single student in your room.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at climbing the academic wall. Then we'll unpack scaffolding in grips and harnesses. Third, we cover differentiation through adjusting the path. Fourth, we've got a critical warning in avoiding the metaphorical escalator. And finally, we wrap it all up in the synergistic classroom.
All right, let's get into part one, climbing the academic wall.
To really get a handle on educational support, we have to recognize up front that modern schooling has rightly ditched that outdated one-size-fits-all model. But while both scaffolding and differentiation reject that kind of rigidity, they actually operate on completely different axes. Imagine an academic challenge as a massive, towering rock-climbing wall. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how the two approaches diverge. Scaffolding? That represents the temporary handholds, the grips, the safety harnesses. These are highly specific, micro-level supports given to make sure a learner can climb a particular, challenging height safely. They don't change the wall itself, they just help you scale it. Differentiated instruction, on the other hand, is a macro-level responsive approach. It ensures the wall itself is adjusted. Maybe that means changing the height or building multiple distinct pathways to accommodate the varying profiles, readiness levels, and interests of our different climbers. Simply put, one supports the climber, while the other adapts the environment.
Moving right along to part two, scaffolding, grips and harnesses.
Now that we've got our rock climbing metaphor locked in, let's zoom in on those precise, step-by-step cognitive supports we call scaffolding. You might be wondering, where did this whole idea of instructional grips and harnesses actually come from? And how does it actively pull a student's cognitive development forward? Well, it all traces back to the theorist Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky argued that cognitive development is inherently social. It doesn't just happen in a vacuum. He coined a brilliant term for this, the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. Think of ZPD as this fertile, magical space right between what a student can do completely on their own and what they absolutely cannot do, even if you help them. At the time, Vygotsky was actually pushing back hard against Jean Piaget's dominant theory, which saw kids as these lone, autonomous discoverers constrained only by biology. Vygotsky said, no way. He believed that cooperative problem-solving with a more knowledgeable other is what truly unlocks a child's potential. Real instruction doesn't just sit around waiting for development to happen, it actively pulls it forward.
Let's move to and see how this builds into actionable, everyday classroom practice. Decades after Vygotsky, researchers formalized his ideas into what's known as the gradual release of responsibility model. It's a classic four-step process. We start with step one, the focus lesson, where the teacher models their own internal thinking out loud, literally doing think-alouds. Step two is guided instruction. This is where you use robust prompts and cues to guide them without ever just giving away the answer. Step three moves into collaborative work in peer spaces, which builds shared understanding while maintaining individual accountability. And finally, step four is independent learning. Now, the absolute secret sauce here is something called the contingent shift. That just means the instructional support dynamically scales back as the learner internalizes the skill. The help fades out, and the autonomy fades in.
Before we jump over to differentiation, we really need to set up some guardrails between these frameworks to avoid any pedagogical confusion. Looking at these models side by side, notice how scaffolding is targeted at literally anyone learning. It could be the whole class, a small group, or just one individual. But the ultimate key takeaway here, and please, if you hear nothing else today, hear this, is that scaffolding proactively preserves absolute grade-level rigor. You are not lowering the bar for anyone. You are simply providing a temporary ladder to help them reach that bar.
All right, part three, differentiation, adjusting the path.
We're shifting gears now. We're moving away from the logical, step-by-step structure of teaching a specific skill and zooming out to a broader, student-aligned instructional philosophy. This is all about how we respond to the very real diversity in our classrooms, an approach championed by the amazing Carol Ann Tomlinson. Her framework breaks down into four core dimensions. First up is content. This means modifying the materials students use to access knowledge, like using digital platforms to tweak the reading level of a text while keeping the core topic exactly the same. Second is process. This is varying the cognitive paths. For example, some kids might use hands-on math manipulatives to solve a problem while others use abstract formulas. Third is product, which is offering diverse ways for kids to actually show you what they know. Think of a choice board where a student can choose to write a traditional essay or record a podcast. And finally, environment and affect, optimizing the physical and emotional vibe of the room itself. When teachers execute this macro-level approach effectively, tailoring things to student readiness and interests, the research is wild. It shows it can yield more than a full year of cognitive growth within a single school year.
Which brings us to part 4, avoiding the metaphorical escalator.
You know the saying, with great power comes great responsibility. Well, when differentiation is misunderstood, it can actually cause real harm by permanently lowering expectations for students. So the crucial point is that authentic differentiation relies entirely on the principle of teaching up. We have to avoid what we call the metaphorical escalator. This happens when a really well-meaning teacher constantly simplifies the curriculum for a struggling student. Over time, that student basically gets placed on an isolated, low-rigor academic track. And as the gap between their track and actual grade-level standards widens year after year, it becomes an escalator they literally can never step off of. Differentiation is never, ever an excuse to lower the standard. It is simply a way to alter the access pathways while keeping the final destination exactly the same.
Finally, part 5, the synergetic classroom. Let's put this all together.
So how do we actually pull this off in real life without completely burning out? Let's move from all this theory into a highly practical application. We're going to look at a real-world scenario to see how scaffolding and differentiation play together beautifully in a single lesson. Imagine you're walking into an 8th grade literacy classroom. The academic standard for the day is incredibly rigorous, and importantly, it is expected of every single student. They have to read a historically complex speech, let's say George Washington's farewell address, or maybe Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman? They have to track the development of the author's argument, and finally, they have to write an analytical paragraph explaining how the author used rhetorical devices to create an emotional or logical appeal. This is the uncompromised standard, no exceptions.
So what is the teacher's very first move? They deploy proactive, skill-aligned scaffolding to the entire class. Think of these as universal training wheels, applied before any differentiation even happens. Right at minute 0, they use vocabulary front-loading. They introduce tricky terms like pathos or ethos, using everyday relatable analogies and quick sketches on the board before anyone even touches a dictionary. At minute 15, we get into show and tell modeling. The teacher projects a paragraph and does a think aloud to demonstrate exactly how to infer an appeal. By minute 30, everyone in the room gets graphic organizers to help them visually map out the arguments. And at minute 45, the teacher builds in structured turn-and-talk routines to ensure everyone is cognitively processing the material. Everybody gets the grips and harnesses.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing how the teacher dynamically layers differentiation right on top of that baseline scaffolding. When it's time for the reading and analysis phase, the teacher adjusts the process and product based on learner variance. Check out these distinct pathways. Your gifted learners, they might bypass the collaborative annotation entirely and do an independent text comparison with a modern-day speech. The standard readiness group collaborates in peer pairs, leaning on those graphic organizers we just talked about. And the English learners or students with IEPs, notice they are absolutely not given a simpler text. Instead, they work in a small group directly with the teacher. They use audio support and a strive for 5 back-and-forth dialogue framework to prompt really deep critical thinking. The destination, that rigorous analytical goal, remains exactly the same for everyone. It's only the pathways that adapt.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a super actionable mnemonic tool you can use right away, the KARR reflective check. Whenever you're planning, ask yourself, does your instructional task ensure clarity of the objective? Can all students access the core content independently through tailored pathways? Is there rigor that keeps them right in their zone of proximal development, and is there relevance to their own prior experiences? If you can confidently answer yes to those 4 questions, you are masterfully combining the structural support of scaffolding with the adaptive pathways of differentiation. So, my final question for you to chew on is this. Looking at your own classroom or learning environment tomorrow, which metaphorical escalator can you dismantle, and how are you going to build a better wall? Thanks so much for learning with me today.